Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Syria. I'm Sue Turton. A strong message to the West and the countries implicated in the war on Syria. President Bashar al-Assad says his election victory will give his regime fresh legitimacy. But the polls in the midst of war have drawn sharp criticism from the international community. It was an election described by the US as a great big zero, but one that the government said proved that the Syrian people are determined to choose their fate on their own and to look to the future. President Bashar al-Assad has been returned for a third term in office with 89% of votes cast. But people were only able to register their choice in government-held areas, or roughly half of the country. In these areas, voter turnout was reported to be 73%. Well, to our discussion in a moment, including the growing influence of the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah. But first, how the election victory was reported by Al Jazeera's Rula Amin from Beirut.
Supporters of President Bashar al-Assad flocked the streets to celebrate his win. Even in Homs, known as the capital of the revolution and now under the full control of the Syrian army, there were people on the streets cheering for Assad. The opposition and its international and regional allies dismiss these elections as a joke, illegal, and say they do not represent the Syrian people. But the government is not deterred by these allegations.
The Syrian people have passed their test in democracy with distinction. They have set an example for democracy in its best forms, one that can be an example for the rest of the world to follow, given the election process's transparency and integrity.
Pro-government TV networks filled their screens with joyful crowds. The target are those Syrians who are in the middle.
The message that they get is we're approaching game over and the regime is winning. A lot of refugees outside and even inside are now extremely exhausted as a result of this conflict, and all they want is resolution one way or another. Unfortunately, the calls for peace and democracy and reform are slowly disappearing in Syria and being replaced with just calls for basic needs. And so Bashar is sending the message that he's the only one who can restore the basic needs for his own people.
Assad's win of a new term comes as his troops on the ground continue to advance, regaining control of rebel-held areas. Despite the world's condemnation of his election, President Assad believes he can build on it.
For Assad, he is gambling on the international community eventually cooperating with him as a result of the election, because he is trying to present himself as fighting terrorism. And as we know, terrorism is a rising regional problem. So that's what Assad is counting on.
But the international community is trying to avoid doing that. Yet its choices of ways to sideline Assad are also limited. The Syrian opposition's own weaknesses and divisions hurt any plan to change the balance of power on the ground. Rula Amin, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of Inside Syria. In London, Amir Wakaf, a Syrian political activist who advocates reform rather than a change in regime. Joining us from Beirut is Jamal Wakim, a writer for the Foreign Policy Journal and author of the book The Struggle of Major Powers Over Syria. And also coming from London, we have James Denslow, research associate at the Foreign Policy Centre and a Middle East security analyst. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us on Inside Syria. Amir Wakaf, maybe I could just start with you and touch on this criticism of these elections that we're hearing they weren't fair, they weren't transparent from the West. Why hold elections anyway if you can only turn to half the electorate in a country that's at war?
Well, the country is pretty much divided in a sense. The people are pretty much divided. As a Syrian citizen, I would prefer a government with a fresh mandate than a government that has lost its mandate, so to speak. And in a sense, a lot of Syrians who dictated all these elections, those Syrians, I mean, by them, I mean those who live inside Syria, who are pretty much suffering on a daily basis of the deteriorating security situation, livelihood situation, and so on and so forth. They need a government that is pretty much coherent, and or that they can trust to take them out of this bottleneck. So that's why they need a government with a fresh mandate. They cannot wait for Geneva and the international community to agree on something. Actually, the international community seems to be differing on every single subject now, starting Ukraine and whatever. So the people of Syria need to give this sort of government a mandate to feel safe. Let
me turn to James Denslow.
Like
Do you agree with this, James Denslow? Has this moved the situation in Syria on in any way?
I think these elections are the closing of a chapter that started with the Geneva II conference that was supposedly about the transition of power in Syria, but is now collapsed. Brahimi's gone. Homs, the capital of the revolution, has been retaken, and now these elections have conferred 7 more years upon Assad, according to the population who voted. Of course, a large population didn't. They voted with their feet, quite literally. 6.5 million internally displaced, over 1.6 million refugees. So I think it is about messaging. It's about a message to the international community. Your piece started with Assad quoted as saying a war on Syria, not a war in Syria, which again is a large part of his strategy to externalize this. It's about foreign enemies. It's about a conspiracy. It's about terrorism. So I think this election will not really change anything practically on the ground. I think we're at a start of a new chapter, one that may be defined by Western powers in particular looking to reassess their policy towards Syria. We saw Obama talk about that at West Point speech a few weeks ago. So I think we've yet to see how this will still play in the next few months.
Jamal Wakim, the view from Beirut, from Lebanon, indeed. We saw celebrations after the election. What is the general attitude, would you say, for what's just happened across the border with this poll? Do Lebanese think it was a waste of time, or do they think it was quite instructive?
Well, there are different reactions to the elections in Syria. Of course, there were the ones who opposed these elections and consider that it's not credible. And of course, there are the supporters of the Syrian regime who considered that these elections was more of a declaration of victory by the Assad regime. I believe that there are fractions of truth from both sides. After all, elections in the Arab world are happening with a big question mark even after the Arab Spring. But I believe that there was a big support for the Assad regime for various reasons. Many people, of course, opposed the regime in the beginning, but they got tired after 3 years of war. Other people, of course, they supported the regime because the alternative was not that positive for them. Many refugees outside Syria got tired by their miserable situation, especially in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. So all these factors led to these elections. Of course, that was used by the regime to claim legitimacy on one hand, and at the same time, I believe that it got support. It got support from strong allies like Russia, Iran, China, but also from Brazil, Venezuela, and other delegations that attended the elections and, of course, acknowledged these elections. I believe that the Syrian crisis will continue for a while because it's not for regional and international reasons, because it has a local dimension, but also it has a regional and international one. It does.
We will definitely explore the wider implications in just a second. I just want to turn to Ammar Wakaf again. Just on this point that only half of the country got out and voted because of the areas that they live in. Does this really point to the fact that we are still maybe looking at that the president is unable to unite the country now? It's gone way beyond that, and we could be looking at a kind of split down the lines that we've just seen the election could be held in?
Well, I'll come to the main point of your question later, but I need to correct. I don't think it's only half of the country. Actually, I think it's more than half of the country. First of all, the government controls the major urban areas in Syria, and then you have at least half of the displaced people running from the fighting areas actually going to the areas that are controlled by the government. So you have a sort of majority. I think the government said like 15 million people as an official figure of those who are eligible to vote. vote. And that's
I think
more
we heard
than
it was
half
11.
of the Syrians
I think it was less than that in the official figure. But please carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
The ones who did vote were about 11 million, so on. But those who were eligible were like 50 million, and that tells you that that's more than half of the population. And then you have a lot of refugees, as we've seen actually in Lebanon, which was the turning point in a sense, or the most significant message. Those refugees outside Syria who are officially registered as anti-regime, so to speak, actually went and sent a message by going to the embassy and doing the vote and casting their vote that they are willing to engage with the government once more. So you have, I think, more.
But that was no way the majority
of
of
the population.
refugees. It was a small percentage, you might admit.
Well, yes, they, I think, opened the way. And if you had more countries participating, like in the UAE or France and Germany, probably even more refugees would have cast their vote. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that there is a shift that is happening here, that those who are tired of this, those who cannot, believe their leadership anymore, or are tired of, void promises by either the international community or what they perceive to be their leaders, are willing to engage with the government.
Let me just take that point that you've just made. Sorry. James Denslow, do you think we've just heard the voice of the majority of the Syrian people voting in this election?
I think it's very hard to tell. I mean, there's been referendums in the past where 90+% of people have voted for Bashar, and that I don't think that codifies a sort of normal sense of legitimacy in sort of political scientific terms. I'll tell you who definitely didn't vote: the 160,000 people who've been killed, the 200,000 people who've been killed due to a lack of medical facilities in Syria since the war. So huge numbers of people are obviously dead. I think that's a starting point here. This is a country at civil war, and if a country's leader says the choice is between utter chaos or the stability you once had, I think people are tired. I think that is a fair point. Does that codify some kind of legitimacy as, for a future of a country? I'm not so sure. And I think, again, that will be the challenge, not just in terms of where the civil war goes next. And remember, in Aleppo, we've got a vicious battle between barrel bombs and tunnel bombs happening as we speak in the biggest city in Syria. So ideas of where the civil war goes. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago that Damascus volcano, the opposition's attacks, were in the heart of the regime's capital. And so we can't necessarily predict where this will go next, and legitimacy perhaps only works on that kind of scale.
Well, the US has described Syria's presidential election as a disgrace. On a surprise visit to Lebanon, Secretary of State John Kerry branded the polls as meaningless and amounting to a great big zero. And as far as US policy was concerned, he said nothing has changed between the day before the election and the day after. But reacting to that on Friday, the leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah movement said the election proved that any solution to the conflict rested with Bashar al-Assad.
Any political solution in Syria begins and ends with President Dr. Bashar al-Assad. That is what the election says. There is an elected president with a new mandate of 7 years, elected by millions. Anyone who wants to reach a political solution has to talk with him, to negotiate with him, to discuss with him, and reach a solution with him. What can the solution be? This has become the concern of Syrians.
So what impact is Hezbollah's involvement in Syria having on the conflict? Zaina Hodder is in Antakya, close to Turkey's border with Syria, with an assessment of the movement's influence.
There are many who believe that the Syrian government wouldn't have been able to gain more territory without the help of Hezbollah. Now, the Syrian government has managed to secure Damascus. It has managed to take control of the city of Homs, that's in central Syria. By doing this, it now secured the road between the capital and its stronghold along the coast. These are strategic gains. Now, Hezbollah hasn't shied away from the fact that it is involved in the war. It has sent hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters to help the Syrian government as they battle opposition forces. For Hezbollah, for them, this is an existential struggle. They believe if they lose Assad's Syria as an ally, then they would really lose a lot. Syria's Assad supports them. It's how they transport weapons into Lebanon. But this has come at a very high price for Hezbollah. It was once seen not only in Lebanon Lebanon, but throughout the Arab world as a resistance force that was able to stand up against Israel, particularly during the 2006 war. Now it is increasingly being seen as a Shia force, projecting its power at the expense of Sunnis. The war in Syria to some extent has become a Sunni-Shia conflict as much as it is a proxy conflict as well between regional powers. But Hezbollah has made clear that they don't intend to change their policy, and for them they're using the same narrative as the Syrian government, and that is this the war in Syria is nothing more than a conspiracy because Syria supports groups that oppose Israel.
Well, let's get more from our guests on the impact of Hezbollah. Jamal Hakim, if I can ask you first. I remember being in Syria in early 2013 and we'd watched the momentum go with the rebels, and then it just seemed to shift. And that seemed to be about the time we were hearing there were Hezbollah fighters in the country, as well as other nationalities. Did Hezbollah have a real impact? Did it tip the balance when it joined the fight?
I don't believe that Hezbollah tilted the balance of the struggle going on in Syria. Of course, the assistance that Hezbollah gave to the Syrian regime, to the Syrian military, I believe it was important. But after all, if we compare the military force of Hezbollah to that of the Syrian army, on one hand, there is a big difference. On the other hand, Hezbollah doesn't know the ground like the Syrian army does. And the biggest support that the Syrian regime enjoyed came from major powers like Russia, Iran, and China. So I don't think that Hezbollah can be considered as a minor ally to the Syrian regime.
Why do you think it's so important for Hezbollah to be involved in the Syrian fight and to be backing Bashar al-Assad?
Of course, Hezbollah had big interest for the survival of the regime in Syria, because the Syrian regime has been a supporter of Hezbollah for the past 3 decades. At the same time, there were other Lebanese, let's say, contributors to the Syrian crisis who fought with the insurgents. So the biggest contribution of Hezbollah was to block or to limit the damage done by these groups by participating in the conflict going on there. I don't believe that Hezbollah tilted the balance. After all, it was the strong support by Russia, China, and Iran against the United States, Europe, and Turkey that made the regime, that gave the regime the possibility to resist the attacks to topple it.
Amal Wakaf, would you say that actually morale improved enormously with these fighters coming in to join the ranks of the Syrian army?
No, I don't think so to that extent. I think the morale came from stabilizing the situation, being a little bit more skillful in going on attacks so as to reduce the number of casualties, being more tactful in repulsing attacks as well. Hezbollah hasn't, as far as I understand, hasn't really participated in many battles. They've pretty much been focused on their own backyard, the border with Lebanon, sort of Qalamoun area, so to speak, in addition to a few issues of spiritual nature. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah cannot be this huge human resource tank for the Syrian army. The Syrian army stands well on its feet. And but again, the notion of the government on its as itself, keeping on its feet, the army being more skillful and having these small gains slowly but surely, that's what boosts the morale of the Syrian army, I think.
James Denslow, just give us a sense of the wider picture here. We're talking about Hezbollah joining the Syrian forces, but we aren't really touching yet on the fact that this is an incredibly strategic addition to this fight, and there's a reason behind Hezbollah doing that.
No, I think Hezbollah has played an important role in this sort of counter-offensive, and I think it's a really important question to look at the future of the Syrian state and its attempt to sort of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, because your other guests touched upon it, the support from Russia and Iran, Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, it shows you, I think, a kind of outsourcing of the defense of the regime. And that, it was interesting that after the recapturing of Homs, there was some fighting between pro-regime militias. And I think that could be a way of things to come, perhaps, depending on how easy it is to integrate these groups, something that in Lebanon, of course, armed groups are still not integrated into the state very clearly. Hezbollah is a tough experience, a very effective counterinsurgency force. It has been proven to be, especially in the border areas near to Lebanon. So I think it did play an important role. We've seen that. But also the fact that the opposition was deeply split and had issues with extremist groups and sort of third fronts in the north did also have factors too. So it's a combination of these things. I wouldn't say that filling a barrel full of chlorine and dropping it on Aleppo is a smart weapon. So I don't think necessarily the regime is kind of fundamentally changing its tactics. I think it has been a sense again of huge amounts of support from the region to these groups and a kind of lack of strategic support, and of course the issue of certain weapons from the West and other regional powers. Jamal Wakim,
you talked earlier about how there are so many different groups in Lebanon and the reaction to the election. I'm just thinking about the fact that Hezbollah has got involved may well have backfired in certain numbers of those groups. I'm thinking obviously particularly the Sunnis inside Lebanon, and you know, whether this is going to have an impact on Hezbollah really in the future.
First of all, I don't believe that Hezbollah had forced some Syrians to participate in the elections, because too many Syrians came from regions controlled by the opponents of Hezbollah, like the Akkar region and Tripoli region. So I believe that there was an impulse by the Syrians to vote in the elections because they wanted peace after all. I believe that the Syrian refugees in Lebanon might destabilize the country, because there is a huge number compared to the population in Lebanon. Many of them are either supporters or opponents to the regime, and there have been conflicts between them even on Lebanese territory, but at limited scale. So I believe that this issue should be solved, otherwise it might destabilize the country and make it get involved in maybe it might lead even to civil war.
James Denslow,
especially that we have fractured politics in Lebanon.
Okay. James Denslow, just looking towards the end of the programme now, but what are we looking to the future really with the Syrian opposition? Are they really looking at an end game here? Is there anything that they can do really to lift themselves? Because it seems everything is going against them at the moment.
I think you're right that the narrative would appear that way, but there's been a long talked about southern offensive and fighters that have been trained in Jordan that has yet to truly materialise. There is still some bit of fighting going on around the Latakia region. The actual fate of Aleppo remains in the balance. And of course there are these questions as to what more effective support from outside could do. Could it shoot down some of those helicopters dropping those barrels, for example? So I think we shouldn't again fall into the trap to thinking that this is, you know, the end of fighting within a year and that the elections are just the icing on a cake of the end of the civil war. I think it seems that all major powers have agreed that this is something that could go on for a long, long time, and sadly we're only 3 years in. And I think the point about Lebanon and 1.6 million refugees have gone out into the region, but Lebanon is 1 in 3 now a Syrian, is a real worry for the international community and the region. Amo
Wakaf, are we now looking at a completely dead in the water Geneva initiative, bearing in mind that you're now saying the President has a mandate?
Well, I think the Geneva initiative sort of lost its speed, lost its steam, wind break out of the sail. Nothing really is happening on that front because it seemed to be very futile. I think the new political process is that the current government set up in Syria has the majority of the votes. They have a fresh mandate. Now, the Syrian opposition, need to get out of the denial that they are having, you know, this is a sham, this is a not really legitimate, and so on and so forth. And they need to see that the refugees who supported them at a certain time, at a certain moment in time, are actually going to engage with the government, and they should find themselves and get their act together. And with regards to the international community, you know, getting this messages out that this is, you know, a zero thing, and again, it's a sham, it's a hilarious move, and so on. They need to understand that what kept the government in Syria on its feet for the past 3 years is not going to go very easily. There are a lot of Syrians who are paying dearly in order to do so, and they need to start to engage with the Syrian government. There is no alternative. Otherwise, it's just about postponement of this of the solution and pretty much, if someone has this idea in mind, is just about making the crisis sustainable. And that's not for anybody's interest, I think, you know, to make it sustainable, because that would have, you know, implications on what is happening in Europe in terms of training people.
Amar Wakaf, I'm going to have to stop you there. So sorry, we've run out of time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for talking to us. Amar Wakaf and James Denslow from London, and Jamal Wakim speaking to us from Beirut. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria on air and online. I'm Sue Turton. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.